The snow was melting in the Bavarian Alps, but the world below was burning. Spring 1945. The Third Reich was in its death throes. Cities lay in ruins, trains derailed, bridges bombed. Allied forces pushed in from the west. Soviet tanks thundered from the east, and what remained of Hitler's war machine was splintering like glass under a hammer. SS Colonel Wilhelm Steinmann stood at the edge of it all, watching it collapse from behind the thick stone walls of his command post near Garmisch. He was a man of discipline and shadows, a career officer known for loyalty, silence, and an almost pathological obsession with control. Those who worked under him feared him. Those above him trusted him to handle the kind of orders that didn't make it onto paper. On April 29th, Hitler was still holed up in his bunker. By May 1st, he was dead. Berlin was lost. The chain of command was fractured, brittle. Deserters were being shot in the streets, while entire SS divisions vanished into the forests. But Steinmann remained calm. He had not been seen in uniform for days. Aides whispered that he was packing documents, not orders. He held no final meetings. He issued no parting commands. Then, as the American 44th Infantry moved closer to Garmisch, Wilhelm Steinmann simply vanished. The official report stated that his final communiqué was logged on May 3rd, a coded message with no apparent meaning. Alpine Dämmerung begins. Alpine twilight. After that, nothing. He was not among the surrendering officers. His family never heard from him again. Some said he shot himself rather than face trial. Others believed he'd escaped across the border into Switzerland or gone underground with stolen gold and sensitive documents. But there was no body, no bullet, no grave. Only a missing name on a long list of war criminals who never faced justice. In the decades that followed, Steinmann's name became one of whispered legend mentioned in obscure footnotes, conspiracy forums, and scattered intelligence files. A ghost in an officer's coat. Some said he was spotted in Argentina in 1951. Others swore he helped build post-war bunkers for the Odessa network. But in truth, no one really knew. The war had ended, the world had moved on, and Colonel Wilhelm Steinmann had disappeared without a trace. The 5th of May, 1945. The roads through southern Bavaria were crumbling, bombed, blocked, abandoned. Convoys of panicked Wehrmacht soldiers scrambled to surrender, while civilians fled deeper into the Alps with whatever they could carry. Somewhere before dawn, Wilhelm Steinmann left the old hunting lodge that had served as his temporary command center for the past week. He wasn't wearing his full uniform. Just boots, a civilian jacket, and a satchel no one would ever open. He said nothing to the guards posted outside. He didn't take the staff car, he took the back road. By mid-morning, the lodge was empty. American troops arrived that afternoon to find maps still spread across the table, a half-drunk bottle of schnapps, and an untouched Luger on the desk. The safe had been emptied. The logs had been scrubbed. No one could say where Steinmann had gone, only that he had left alone. 2 days later, near the Austrian border, a local farmer reported black smoke curling up through the trees. Military police arrived to find a burned-out Mercedes staff car overturned in a ravine. In the passenger seat, a charred corpse wearing a driver's coat. No dog tags, no identifying features, just ashes, bone, and silence. Investigators assumed the driver had tried to flee, perhaps taking a vehicle meant for a superior officer. But there was no trace of Steinmann himself. No blood, no footprints, not even a second body. It didn't make sense. A man like him wouldn't simply vanish, not without help, not without a plan. For weeks, Allied intelligence combed the region. The border was sealed. Checkpoints tightened. A dozen rumors bloomed. Some claimed he had slipped into Italy disguised as a priest. Others swore he'd shot his driver and escaped on foot, headed into the high passes on a smuggler's trail. A few even believed he never left the forest at all, that he was buried beneath the wreckage, unrecognizable and forgotten. But something felt wrong. There was no desperation in his exit, no chaos. It was quiet, methodical. A man folding up a uniform and stepping into silence. He didn't run. He disappeared. And for 80 years, that's where the story stopped. Until a hiker stumbled across a hidden cabin buried in Alpine rock and found what no one ever expected: the colonel, still sitting exactly where he left himself. To understand why Wilhelm Steinmann vanished so completely, you have to understand who he was before the war began to crumble. Steinmann was not a loud man. He did not drink with subordinates or boast of medals. He was precise, deliberate, and unsettlingly calm. Born in 1901, near Innsbruck, he grew up in the mountains, the son of a railway engineer who taught him how to read terrain the way others read maps. Long before he wore an SS uniform, Steinmann trained as an architect, specializing in structural design in extreme environments. He understood load-bearing stone, airflow, concealment. He knew how to make something permanent disappear into the landscape. When the war came, those skills proved useful. Steinmann rose quickly, not through charisma, but competence. He was known as a man who solved problems others avoided, fortifications that couldn't be breached, supply routes that left no trace, facilities that officially didn't exist. His postings were rarely announced, and his transfers almost never documented. Those who worked with him described a man obsessed with control, with redundancy, with secrecy layered on top of secrecy. He spoke little, wrote less, and destroyed more paper than he kept. Rumors followed him everywhere. Some claimed he worked directly with SS intelligence, acting as a courier between departments that didn't trust one another. Others believed he oversaw the construction of Alpine redoubts meant to shelter high-ranking officials after Germany's collapse. He had real access to information most officers never saw: internal purges, financial transfers, contingency plans for defeat. Steinmann knew who had stolen what, who had betrayed whom, and who would be blamed when the war ended. That knowledge made him valuable. It also made him dangerous. By 1945, those close to him noticed a change. He no longer spoke of victory, only of containment and preservation. He studied maps of the Alps obsessively, marking routes far from roads or villages. He requested supplies that made no sense for a collapsing army: tools, medical kits, preserved food, civilian clothing. When questioned, he offered no explanation. He didn't need to. Men like Steinmann were never asked twice. And when the Reich fell, he didn't surrender. He simply stepped out of history, carrying secrets no one else was supposed to survive. In 1946, with Europe still smoldering and the machinery of justice grinding into motion, Wilhelm Steinmann's name resurfaced. Allied war crimes investigators flagged him as a priority target. His file was thick, despite the lack of photographs, thicker still because of what was missing. Entire sections of his service record were blank, projects referenced but never described. Witnesses who claimed to have worked under him but could not say where or when. Intelligence officers believed Steinmann hadn't fled in panic. They believed he had escaped with purpose. The theories multiplied quickly. One report suggested he crossed into Switzerland with forged papers and a cache of documents detailing SS financial networks. Another claimed he boarded a rat line through northern Italy, bound for Argentina under the protection of sympathetic clergy. A tip from 1948 placed him in Damascus, advising a foreign military on Alpine fortification techniques. Each lead generated urgency. Each collapsed under scrutiny. No fingerprints, no photographs, no credible sightings. Steinmann was always one step ahead, or nowhere at all. What unsettled investigators most was the silence. Other fugitives surfaced, eventually caught, exposed, or betrayed by time. Steinmann did not. No bank accounts were accessed, no letters intercepted, no known associates came forward. Even his family produced nothing of value, insisting they had been cut off years earlier. Some investigators began to wonder if Steinmann had never left Germany at all, if perhaps the escape narrative itself was the lie. By the early 1950s, resources were being redirected, new conflicts demanded attention, files were consolidated, priorities reassessed. In 1952, Wilhelm Steinmann was officially declared dead in absentia. The cause was listed simply as unknown. No grave was marked, no remains were recovered. His case was archived, boxed, and shelved, another unresolved shadow in the aftermath of a war defined by disappearance. For most, that declaration closed the book. A missing colonel, presumed dead, buried by time. But the mountains had kept their silence, and somewhere high above the valleys, stone and timber waited, holding the truth in cold, patient stillness. As the years crawled forward, the mystery around Wilhelm Steinmann refused to die. Long after his case was declared closed, a quiet undercurrent of curiosity persisted, not just among war historians, but among hobbyists, conspiracy theorists, and backroom archivists who lived for the cold edges of unsolved wartime vanishing acts. Steinmann had no grave marker, no witnesses, just a name and a question. Had he been killed by fellow officers trying to silence him? Did he escape through Vatican channels like others known to have fled? Or had he done something more deliberate, executed a premeditated disappearance right down to the last sealed entryway and burned trail? In the 1960 seconds, a Berlin-based writer researching Nazi redoubt theories claimed Steinmann had engineered a series of Alpine hideouts, one allegedly so remote it could only be accessed on foot. In 1971, an amateur historian linked Steinmann's name to a shipment of gold that vanished from Berchtesgaden's vaults in the final week of the war. But no one could prove a thing. There were always just enough details to spark a theory, never enough to close it. Then, in 1973, a retired schoolteacher renovating a dilapidated farmhouse outside Mittenwald found something odd, a strip of yellowed ledger paper stuffed behind a loose beam. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was sharp, clipped, unmistakably German officer script. One line, Alpendämmerung beginnt. Sie werden es nie finden. Twilight of the Alps begins. They will never find it. The note was turned over to authorities. It made the papers for a week. Then it disappeared, just like Steinmann had. Whether it was a hoax, a forgotten draft, or a real parting shot from a ghost, no one could say. But it reignited interest. More hikers took risks off-trail. More metal detectors swept old smuggler paths. A few claimed success, pointing to empty dugouts or rusted shovels. None of it led anywhere. The Alps had buried better men. They were patient, unkind, and immune to curiosity. And so the cold trail stayed cold. Not for lack of effort, but because there was nothing left to follow. Steinmann, if he had gone underground, had buried his exit well, and if he hadn't, then the mountains had already done it for him. By the 1980 seconds, the world had moved on. The Cold War had redrawn the borders of fear. Espionage was now measured in missiles, not missing men. The files on Wilhelm Steinmann collected dust in a Munich archive, boxed and coded among thousands of unresolved wartime cases. The trail was too cold, the rumors too faint. The name once electric with menace had faded into a historical footnote. Journalists still tried. Every few years, one would dig through the ashes and publish a speculative piece, tying Steinmann to the Odessa network or secret Antarctic colonies. The stories rarely gained traction. Too much time had passed. Too many myths had grown louder. For most, he was just another ghost in a forest full of them. Steinmann's family, at least what remained of them, kept to themselves. A niece in Stuttgart gave a brief interview in 1985, saying her uncle had died with the war. She denied any ongoing correspondence, refused to speculate. A cousin, once asked if the family had ever searched for him, simply replied, "No one searches for shadows." The name was mentioned in fewer history books each year. No school children learned it. No memorial bore it. His face remained unrecorded. If he had died in the Alps, then even the snow had forgotten where. Then, in 1974, came the Ring. A Swiss hiker descending through the southeastern edge of the Austrian Alps near the Karwendel Range stopped to rest near a dried creek bed. Among the gravel, something glinted, a blackened, dented SS officer's ring, the death's head symbol still faintly visible. Inside was a name, barely legible, W. Steinmann. The ring was examined, tested, and deemed authentic. But it raised more questions than answers. Was this proof of a fatal misstep? A staged discard to fake death? Or had it simply fallen off as Steinmann pressed deeper into the mountains? No body was found. No shelter. Just metal and silence. Still, for some, it was enough. The ring became a relic, passed quietly among collectors, mentioned in whisper-level articles. Others dismissed it as irrelevant. Without context, without location, it was just a forgotten possession from a forgotten man. And so Steinmann slipped further from the world's memory, piece by piece. Until one day, nearly 80 years later, the mountains finally gave something back. It was supposed to be a quiet hike, just a familiar trail, a slow climb, and the comforting silence of the high country. Lucas Meissner, 68, retired geography teacher, had spent decades walking these mountains, tracing the folds and ridgelines he once taught his students to understand like old friends. But on the 14th of July, 2024, curiosity tugged him a few hundred meters off course near the Tyrolean-German border, where the trail turned muddy and the trees grew too thick for comfort. He wasn't looking for anything. That's usually when people find something. He saw it just past midday, an odd protrusion breaking the soft palette of green. Not a tree stump, not a rock. Metal. Dull, rusted, almost swallowed by moss. A narrow pipe, maybe 6 inches wide, jutting at an angle from a lichen-covered rock face. Out of place. Wrong. Lucas brushed the moss back and tapped it with the butt of his walking stick. Hollow. He looked up. The slope was steep, the kind where things slide but don't roll. Nothing about the pipe made sense. Then, the timber. Half buried under soil and needles, gray and splintered, but unmistakably shaped. Old wood, rotten but once deliberate. A structure, low and tight against the stone, like someone had been trying to hide it. Lucas dropped to his knees, brushing away decades of decay. There was no visible handle. Just weathered beams wedged into an uneven slot in the rock. The smell was sharp earth, metal, something else. He didn't force the entry. He backed away slowly, heart pounding with something he hadn't felt since childhood. Fear laced with awe. It wasn't a shelter. It wasn't a cave. It was something older, stranger, purpose-built and forgotten. Lucas marked the coordinates with his GPS and hiked back in near silence. The next morning, he contacted local authorities, who passed it along to a historical preservation office in Innsbruck. Within 48 hours, a small team of Alpine specialists arrived, escorted by a mountain patrol unit. Lucas watched as they cleared the site. Axes split through the timber. Beams crumbled. What they found behind that wall would change everything. A sealed passage, cold and dry, a space untouched by light for decades. It was not a cave. It was a room. And what it held inside had been waiting, patiently, for nearly 80 years. The entrance was just wide enough for one person to crawl through. Cold air spilled out from the darkness, stale and dry, preserved like the inside of a sealed box. As floodlights flickered on, dust rose in spirals. The rescuers, archivists, and Alpine police descended one by one into the space, and then stopped. Carved directly into the granite, reinforced with timber ribs and lined with stone slabs, the chamber was not a bunker. It was a cabin, a single room 10 meters deep expertly constructed and almost perfectly preserved. Against the left wall stood a wood-burning stove, its stovepipe running up through the rock and out the same pipe Lucas had seen. To the right, a built-in bunk with mildewed blankets still folded at the foot. Shelves covered one wall, holding rusted tins, medical supplies, and maps. Maps of Bavaria, Austria, and mountain corridors long stripped from public charts. A tin plate rested beside a canteen on a small table. A single candle stub, 2 notebooks stacked neatly, their covers warped but intact. Everything in the space seemed frozen at the exact moment it had last been touched. Then, the chair. It sat facing the far wall, back straight, like someone had been waiting for a knock that never came. And in it, slumped but undisturbed, was a skeleton. The figure wore the remnants of an officer's uniform. The collar tab, blackened but still recognizable, bore the unmistakable SS runes. The skull leaned slightly to the left, resting against the stone. One gloved hand still held what looked like a leather-bound book. The other rested loosely on the armrest. His boots were polished, or had been once. His belt was still buckled. For a long time, no one spoke. A forensic specialist stepped forward and gently unhooked the ring from the skeleton's right hand. A death's head ring blackened, scorched by time. Inside, 2 initials etched in steel, W.S. A DNA test would later confirm it, but they already knew. They were standing inside the last refuge of SS Colonel Wilhelm Steinmann. He hadn't fled to Argentina, he hadn't been captured. He hadn't died in the woods or escaped into myth. He had walked into the rock, sealed the door behind him, and waited for history to forget him, for the mountain to keep its promise. And it had. Until now. The body was removed with precision. Every item photographed, logged, lifted gently from where it had rested for nearly 8 decades. Nothing was disturbed without cause. The skeleton's condition was remarkable. Not mummified, but preserved by the cold, the dry air, the isolation. The bones were intact. No signs of trauma, no fractures, no bullet wounds. Not even a chipped tooth. Forensics moved quickly. Dental records, long buried in a declassified post-war file, matched exactly. A surgical scar, faint but unmistakable on the left femur, confirmed what the teeth already told them. This was Wilhelm Steinmann. Age at death, mid-40 Cause undetermined, but likely natural. Starvation, infection, or simply the slow deterioration of a man alone, buried in stone. Beside the chair, resting on the dusty floor, lay a Luger pistol. The weapon was clean, oiled, and unloaded. Its magazine, still full, was tucked into a drawer beneath the desk. The implication was clear. Steinmann had kept it close, but never used it. This was not suicide, not violence. This was waiting, acceptance. His posture, eerily composed, supported the theory. He had not collapsed in pain or panic. He had taken the chair deliberately, sat down with a final kind of order. Around him were his belongings, ration tins stacked neatly, clothing folded, firewood piled with mathematical precision. Even the stove had been recently cleaned. There was no mess, no struggle, no panic in his last hours. Steinmann had died exactly as he had lived, disciplined, quiet, controlled. The room, the cabin, the body, all bore his fingerprint. There were no companions, no caretakers, just a man and the weight of what he knew. The discovery made headlines across Europe, not just because of the body, but because of what it represented. Closure to one of World War II's longest-standing mysteries. The colonel hadn't fled to South America, hadn't sold secrets, hadn't orchestrated some vast post-war conspiracy. He had gone to the mountains and stopped. But why? What drove a man to build a tomb and wait inside it, silent, for years? The answer came in the form of a box, metal, locked, hidden beneath loose floorboards, and inside, a journal. They nearly missed it. A warped plank beneath the bunk creaked oddly when one of the archivists stepped on it. Beneath, packed in a faded canvas pouch and wrapped in waxed cloth, was a rust-flecked metal box the size of a shoebox. It took nearly half an hour to pry it open without breaking it apart. Inside, untouched by moisture or time, was a leather-bound journal, brittle but legible. The first entry was dated the 9th of May 1945, 2 days after Germany's official surrender. Written in a steady, tight script, the pages began with a phrase that chilled every historian who read it. "The war is over. My service is not." Over 300 pages followed. Daily logs at first, weather, food stores, maintenance, then longer reflections, memories, doubts, confessions. Steinman had not simply vanished, he had exiled himself. The journal revealed that the cabin had been prepared in advance, part of a personal contingency plan he'd begun years earlier. The structure, he wrote, had been built with the Reich's resources, but without its knowledge. It was never meant for survival. It was meant for withdrawal. The tone shifted as the years passed. In 1946, the entries became darker. He described dreams he could not shake, marches in snow, faces he could not name. He wrote often about the final order and the failure of men he once trusted. He claimed to have burned documents that could have redrawn the post-war map, yet gave no details. One entry simply read, "Secrets do not belong to the dead." The most harrowing section came in the summer of 1947. The writing became sparse, the lines more philosophical. He wrote about the noise fading and the gravity of silence. By September, his last pages were barely legible. The final entry, dated the 3rd of September 1947, read, "I have done what I was ordered. I have done what I must. The mountain will hold it now." No signatures, no names, just the closing of a mind coming to rest. He had lived alone in that cabin for over 2 years, survived through rationing, melted snow, and a strict daily regimen. But in the end, time was the one thing he couldn't outlast. Steinman died as he planned, in silence, unseen. But now, at last, the mountain was speaking, and the world was listening. The deeper investigators read into Steinman's journal, the less it resembled a diary and more a slow-motion unraveling. What began as a log of daily survival soon transformed into a grim confessional, a document written by a man with too much knowledge and nowhere left to put it. As the months passed, his entries drifted from the practical to the haunted. He described voices in the wind, dreams that bled into daylight, and the oppressive silence that pressed like ice against the skull. The term "cleansing what's left of the soul" appeared repeatedly. Sometimes in reflection, other times in command-like phrasing, as if quoting doctrine or orders never issued through official channels. He spoke of moral rot, of those who failed the vision, and of quiet tasks that secured the future. The tone was neither apologetic nor boastful, it was clinical, resigned. There was no mention of remorse, only process. Scattered throughout were references to locations high in the Alps, marked only by initials or vague descriptors, the green door above the glacier, the cold mouth under the ridge. Steinman referred to these as nodes, suggesting a network of remote sites established for reasons never clarified. In one cryptic entry, he noted, "The South Pass is sealed. Brenner's men made sure of that. Only Schneegrat remains, but they don't know about the drop." Names began appearing in later entries. Names not found in official archives, never linked to war crimes, yet written with an unmistakable familiarity. Some bore ranks. Others were noted with annotations like erased 10.44 or transferred not recorded. It was a ghost list people deliberately removed from history. But what made the journal truly chilling were the passages hinting at unsanctioned missions, orders not filed, operations without paper trails. Steinman wrote about extractions, cleansings, and a final instruction buried. where only the mountain breathes. He never said what the instruction was, only that it was too dangerous to carry and too unforgivable to destroy. One line stood out, underlined twice. This is not escape. This is burial with purpose. Steinman had not vanished to hide. He had vanished to entomb something the world was never meant to dig up. And then came the discovery of the false wall. The cabin had already given up more than anyone had expected. A body, a journal, a vanished man returned to history. But the mountain wasn't finished. 3 days after the remains were removed, a preservationist tracing condensation patterns along the rock face noticed an inconsistency. Behind a shelf of old supply crates, the stone sounded hollow. Carefully, a narrow panel was removed, timber disguised to match the rest of the cabin structure. Behind it, a cavity no wider than a coffin. And inside, a weatherproof chest, sealed in wax, stamped with a black Reichadler crest. It hadn't been disturbed in nearly 80 years. When opened, the cache stunned everyone. Dozens of documents, bound in faded twine, stamped "Nur für den Dienstgebrauch," for official use only. Microfilm canisters packed in lead cases. Notebooks filled with tight, angular code. Maps marked with red pencil and strange symbols. This wasn't a soldier's diary stash. This was an intelligence vault. The material was rushed to a secure facility in Innsbruck. Decryption teams and historians pored over every scrap. What they found redrew parts of the war's final chapter. There were detailed surveillance notes on Allied troop movements in 1944 and 1945, clearly sourced from high-level intercepts. Reports on desertions within the Wehrmacht, internal purges, secret transfers of political prisoners. Then came the names again. Not the well-known architects of the Reich, but mid-tier figures, many presumed unremarkable, except these documents showed otherwise. In marginal notes, some were listed as participants in classified operations, Arctic convoys, occult research, early rocket site evacuations, missions not found in any formal military archive. One folder drew particular attention, labeled simply Erlösung, Redemption. Inside, a series of hand-typed sheets detailing a proposed program for post-war ideological continuity. Decentralized cells, ideological preservation, relocation of core assets. Most chillingly, it included a list of school names, university departments, and press agencies throughout post-war Europe. It was not a survival plan. It was a plan for influence. Historians still debate how much of it was implemented, if any. But the existence of the documents raised uncomfortable questions about what survived the Third Reich's collapse, about what Steinman had been guarding. This wasn't just a dead man in a hidden room. It was a blueprint buried in stone, a secret that might not have ended when the war did. News broke quietly at first, a brief mention in a Tyrolean paper, a local piece about a hiker discovering a sealed wartime shelter. But within 48 hours, the story ignited. Headlines across Europe and beyond lit up with a name that hadn't appeared in public print since the 1,950 seconds, Wilhelm Steinman found. Television crews camped outside the mountain trailhead, drones buzzed overhead, and journalists clamored for access to what historians quickly began calling the most significant World War II discovery in decades. This wasn't a rusted rifle or another sunken U-boat. This was a preserved command post, a body, a journal, a sealed cache of documents that had evaded war tribunals, intelligence agencies, and historians for nearly 80 years. The fascination wasn't just about the man, it was about the intent. Steinman hadn't been running. He had planned to vanish. He had built his disappearance. The press couldn't get enough. Every new photo of the cabin, the journal pages, the officer's ring pushed the story deeper into public obsession. News anchors spoke of the man who buried himself alive. Social media ran wild with images of the rock face, and phrases like Alpine trended for days. Historians pored over the documents with both reverence and unease. The find was a goldmine, but also a minefield. Some materials hinted at operations long scrubbed from records. Others mentioned institutions and locations that still existed. Steinman's own journal had blurred lines between memory, mission, and madness, making interpretation a careful act of balancing fact against implication. And then came the noise. Conspiracy forums erupted overnight. Some claimed the cache was planted. Others believed Steinman was guarding evidence of Nazi contact with foreign powers or something stranger. One theory suggested the Erlösung folder was part of a psychological warfare program still active under another name. Another insisted the real Steinman had escaped and the skeleton was a body double left behind. But amid the chaos, one fact remained. A man who was supposed to have disappeared into legend had instead been waiting in the dark, surrounded by his own secrets, not lost, not forgotten. Simply sealed away, like an infection, the mountain had finally decided to expel. Whatever Steinman had been hiding, whether secrets, shame, or silence, it had survived him. And now the world was listening. The last page of the journal was dated the 3rd of September 1947. The handwriting, once steady and controlled, was frail, shaking at the edges, ink blotted where his hand must have trembled. The sentence was short. Final. The mountains are quiet now. I am no longer pursued. I am already gone. That was it. No signature, no explanation, no farewell. Just a line that read less like a goodbye and more like an epitaph carved from the inside. Forensic analysis placed his death sometime within days of that final entry. There were no signs of violence, no wounds, no trauma. The rations had dwindled, the stove had gone cold. A sealed jar of snowmelt sat untouched beside the bed. One medical expert believed he died of kidney failure brought on by long-term malnutrition. Another suggested a stroke. But the consensus was quiet. He had chosen to stay. Chosen to die there, in the dark, on his own terms. The journals hinted at illness in the final weeks, brief mentions of dizziness, pain in his lower back, trouble standing. But Steinman had not written as a man seeking help. He had written as a man preparing to vanish. He refused to leave the cabin, even as the mountain remained passable in summer. The door had never been unsealed. The tracks he left had long since vanished beneath snow. What made his final entry so haunting wasn't just the words, it was their weight. I am already gone, as though he had ceased to be long before his body followed. As though the act of disappearance was completed not by dying, but by detaching from identity, from history, from humanity. There was no fear in the last line. No desperation, just stillness. Experts read the entry again and again, looking for clues between the words. A code, a cipher, a confession. But in the end, it said exactly what it meant. Wilhelm Steinman had vanished into his own silence, not captured, not executed, not exiled, just gone. And for nearly 80 years, the mountain had kept his secret, until now. By autumn, the winds had returned to the Tyrolean highlands. The moss began to grow back over the disturbed earth, and the trail that led to the hidden shelter was closed to the public. A steel gate was fitted into the rock face, sealed and reinforced. The cabin would not be destroyed, it would be preserved. Officially designated a protected historical site, it stood now as both relic and warning. A war room turned tomb, untouched for nearly 8 decades, the final residence of a man who chose to disappear on purpose. Inside, nothing was moved beyond what was necessary. The bunk, the stove, the candle stump all remained where they had been found. The air had changed, though. The silence wasn't quite the same. Steinman's remains were handled in accordance with Austrian law. There would be no ceremony, no marker, no state acknowledgement. He was cremated and interred in an unmarked grave on the outskirts of Innsbruck. The death certificate listed the date as estimated September 1947. Under nationality, it read unverified. But even in death, Steinman had left behind noise. Not the kind that echoed, but the kind that lingered on paper, in coded ledgers, in questions that refused to settle. Dozens of researchers were still sifting through the cache of documents. Some had been handed to international archives. Others were locked in restricted vaults. A handful disappeared into classified government collections, never to be seen again. What emerged publicly painted only part of the picture. A man entrusted with secrets, a war planner who withdrew rather than testify, a believer in an ideology he never renounced. His journal spoke of obedience, betrayal, and silence, but never guilt, never regret. Debate flared in academic circles. Was Steinman hiding something catastrophic, something that could have altered the post-war order? Or was he simply fleeing a world he no longer recognized, escaping justice he believed was beneath him? Why didn't he run farther? Why choose a stone coffin in the Alps over a new identity abroad? No clear answer ever came. Only fragments, shadows, and so the cabin remains, locked, preserved, whispered about. A monument not to a man, but to a decision to vanish, to wait, to be forgotten. In the end, the war passed. The world changed, but the mountain kept its silence, and for nearly 80 years, that silence was obeyed. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.